Brethren, we're fortunate today to have Dean David Magleby with us. He is the Dean of the Family, Home, and Social Sciences College, as well as one of the founders and principals of the Center for the Study of Elections and Democracy at Brigham Young University. He is one of the, if you had to take a handful, simply a single handful of the most important electoral analysts in the United States, Dave Magleby would have to be in that small handful. He himself is also an expert in what might be called direct or legislative democracy. In fact, has written a book on that subject, looking at, in fact, issues of referenda and initiatives in California. He's going to do an analysis today of some of the implications and the outcomes of the various elections that took place just 2 weeks ago. He himself, in addition to all of his professional responsibilities, he married well above himself. I can attest to that personally. Marvelous woman. Served some years on the general board of the primary. Has 4 children. He himself has served as a bishop and is a member of the stake presidency of the 19th stake, single stake at Brigham Young University. David, it's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Elder Wood, and I'm honored and humbled by this invitation. Brethren, my understanding is that you may have questions. I'd be happy to entertain those as we go, so please don't hesitate. The 2008 election was a remarkable event, as Elder Wood and I were chatting about before we started. For a political scientist, it had so many interesting twists and turns that I'll share only some of them with you today. We had an African-American nominee for the first time. We had the oldest nominee of a major party. We had a serious candidacy from a Latter-day Saint, Mitt Romney. We very nearly had our first female nominee for president in Senator Clinton. It seemed to go on forever, and indeed the protracted contest for the Democratic nomination meant for the first time in many, many years, all of the voters in that party were able to participate meaningfully in caucuses or in conventions or in primaries because they were of consequence. And in some respects, I think that provided Obama and his campaign with the infrastructure to broaden the electoral playing field, as I'll describe in a few minutes. As is normal in a presidential election year, much attention was focused on the contest for the White House, but contests for the U.S. Senate, for the U.S. House, for 11 governorships, and for state legislatures, and especially, as we know very pointedly, on statewide ballot initiatives provided a very dynamic and dramatic election season. The statewide election in California on Proposition 8 was a vote with national implications and is seen as such, I think, not only by members of our faith, but by lots and lots of people around the world. The poor state of the economy, an unpopular war in Iraq, and a nominee that failed to generate much enthusiasm among Republican voters all worked to the benefit of Barack Obama and the Democratic Party. Let's start by taking a look at turnout. This chart plots overall turnout and, I should say, turnout with respect to specific sectors. Turnout overall was up slightly compared to 2004. Given the attention in the media, it was expected that turnout might actually go up even more than it did. A couple of points. It didn't go up more than it did because it went up in some sectors and down in others. As you can see here, it was down for Republicans by nearly 6% overall, by white voters, by those ages 40 to 49, and by moderate voters. In terms of young voters, 18 to 24, it was up. The same for Latino women, people of other races besides whites and Latinos. It was up by about 2% for Democrats, the same for African American and for those of no religion, and up by about 3% for those who claim to be independent. Now, these look like fairly small differences, but in a context like 2008 and given the numbers involved, these were substantial differences and made a big difference in the overall result. So, for instance, It was, as I've said, up modestly for those 18 to 24-year-old and Latino, African Americans, and so forth, but in the context of Proposition 8, which we'll talk about a little later, it made a huge difference for the yes side. That turnout was up for some of these particular segments of voters. Now, in terms of battlegrounds, as I said earlier, the net effect of the long, protracted primary and caucus season and a bold and ambitious plan to compete on a broader battlefield gave Democrats some opportunities that became quite important in the overall election. In 2008, Obama was able to expand the battleground to include previously predictable Republican states like Virginia, North Carolina, Indiana, Colorado, New Mexico, and Nevada. That meant that McCain had to play defense in those previously Republican or Bush in 2000 and 2004 victory states, and also had to play aggressively to hold states that Bush had carried, like Ohio, which, as you can see, is colored blue here, Obama having won Ohio. Now, I should say that in my comments, I'll be referring to some case studies that I'm looking at in 2008 in a project funded by the Pew Charitable Trusts. Since 1998, that foundation has funded research done at BYU that involves teams of academics in key competitive states. And in this election season, we were in North Carolina, Ohio, New Hampshire, Colorado, and New Mexico, all competitive presidential states, but 4 of the 5 had highly competitive Senate elections, and all of them also had competitive House elections. In most of those states, the Republicans had incumbent senators or incumbent House members whose races we were closely monitoring. Now, the states that are colored in yellow are what I'm describing as these expanded battleground states. And as you can see, Obama carried all of those that are colored in that way. Now, you may wonder if I'm confused about Nebraska, because part of it is colored battleground and part of it is not. That's because Nebraska and Maine, alone in our 50 states, allocate their electoral votes not winner-take-all statewide, but winner-take-all by congressional district, and then whoever wins the statewide vote gets the 2 U.S. Senate votes. And Senator Obama, in fact, carried that part of Nebraska colored there as battleground, the Omaha area, narrowly. Much as we've learned today, he carried Salt Lake County narrowly. A big part of the success of the Obama campaign was a widely dispersed and well-organized field operation. In political terms, when we talk about mobilizing voters, registering voters, communicating with voters, we call that field work. And in many ways, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, we shifted to campaigns being largely done on television. And in the late 1990s and into this decade, the field has been rediscovered. And the importance of personal contact, much as we would know from missionary work, face-to-face, reinforced by mail and by phone, is the way campaigns are now waged. If any of us had been living in one of these battleground states, we would have been besieged with mail and phone calls and robocalls, sometimes receiving as many as 14 to 16 pieces of mail a day in the 3 weeks leading up to the election. That was true again in 2008. I was speaking with some consultants on both sides of the campaign last week in Washington, and they mentioned that targeted populations for their group or party committee received as many as 60 different touches, as they describe it, during the course of the general election campaign. That was not necessarily exclusive of the Obama campaign. They had their own operation, and it was scalable and largely volunteer-based. Obama, for instance, set up field offices throughout the battleground states to register voters, to communicate with them, and then to turn them out. And turning out voters has become more complicated in 2008 because we have changed our voting rules. Gone are the days when we all vote on Election Day. And the new mode for at least 30 states in 2008, and I think the number will go up after 2008, is early voting and absentee voting, done somewhat differently in different states, but in Colorado, a battleground state, as much as 75% of the vote was cast before Election Day, either in early voting vote centers or by ballot. As you know, Oregon was the leader in this innovation, having shifted to an entirely vote-by-mail system. Bob? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I saw your hand go up. Apologies. So what that means is the field operation of the campaigns, including ballot proposition campaigns, have to understand that the vote is being cast over a prolonged period. It makes campaigns more expensive because you have to rise to the level of peak communications earlier and sustain them longer, as voters are in fact deciding in their living rooms rather than in the ballot boxes. The outcome was a popular vote majority for Obama of 53%. And while that sounds like a narrow victory, it in fact is a much wider victory in the system designed by our founding fathers, the Electoral College, where Obama is projected to get 68% of the electoral vote. Now, the one state that was in dispute, and I actually spoke to the staff here and had them color Missouri red, was Missouri. I think it's fair to say that that's almost certainly going to be a McCain state, even though final votes are not official in these states until they're certified. His victory margin is wide enough that he can chart, I think, his own course if he wants to. I was meeting with someone on 16th Street in Washington who pointed across the street at the AFL-CIO last week, and this person has previously worked for the unions, and he said the margin is wide enough that he can be his own man even with respect to them, and pointed across the street to the headquarters of the AFL-CIO. So I don't think he will have to accede to the wishes of any single interest group, but I think he demonstrated in the campaign that he's pretty savvy about building coalitions, and he will choose his battles carefully. Before Election Day, groups on both sides of the partisan divide were talking about whether the Democrats would get to a 60-vote majority in the Senate. It takes 60 votes, as you know, for cloture in the Senate, and this number became important for both sides. It became a target for the Democrats, which was, I think, by all accounts, a reach. To have a net gain of 9 seats would have been extraordinary, especially on top of their net gain in the last cycle, which put them barely into the majority. Going into this election, the Senate was essentially tied. 49 Democrats, 49 Republicans, 2 independents who voted with the Democrats, one of whom, as you know, is Senator Lieberman, the other, Socialist Barney Sanders from Vermont. But those 2 independents gave Harry Reid the narrowest of margins, 51-49. That's not going to be the case in the new Senate. He has a lot more room to lead, and that margin could get to 60 votes. It's too soon to know. The news is projecting that in Alaska, which was one of the Senate races which had not been decided, the race has likely not gone to Ted Stevens, and so that would make the margin 58-40 as of today. The 2 states that are not decided are Minnesota, which has a razor-thin margin and will be decided in, I think, a recount mandated by state law in Minnesota, and Georgia, which has an interesting provision. Federalism is still alive and well in our country. State law determines how we elect U.S. senators. And in Georgia, you have to get a majority to go to the Senate. If you fall short of a majority of the votes cast, then you go into a runoff. And so Georgia will have a runoff on December 2nd, I think it is, to determine who will occupy that Senate seat. I think it's unlikely that Chambliss, the incumbent senator from Georgia, will lose. So the margin will either be 58-42 or 59-41, not to the majority that the Democrats had hoped for, and the Republicans and their allied interest groups, most notably the Chamber of Commerce of the United States, were trying very hard to avoid. Newly elected senators include 2 Udalls. Tom Udall from New Mexico and Mark Udall in Colorado, as well as Kay Hagan in North Carolina, Mark Warner in Virginia, and Jeff Merkley, who defeated Latter-day Saint Gordon Smith in a very tight race in Oregon. As of today, the Democrats have a party advantage of about 256 to 176 in favor of Democrats. There are still 3 races by my count, that are undecided, too close to call. That gives the Democrats a net gain of 20 seats. It could go up from that. They did this by picking up All 11 open seats, those were switched from Republican to Democrat hands. Excuse me, they picked up 11 seats. There were more open seats than that. And those 11 went from Republican to Democrat. 13 Republican incumbents were defeated, and 4 Democratic incumbents were defeated. It was not a good year for Republicans at the U.S. Senate or the U.S. House, in U.S. House races. Voters in 3 states cast ballots on same-sex marriage, defining marriage as between a man and a woman. The California measure was the most contested, and the outcome here the closest, 52% voting yes. The vote on Proposition 8 was not unlike the vote on Arizona's Proposition 102, which had 56% voting yes, and Florida's marriage amendment, which passed with 62% voting for it. I'm going to show you some of the demographic trends that explain the slight differences, but by far the California proposition was the most contested and became the focal point. Initiatives have the potential to become agenda setters. The classic example of this would be California's Proposition 13 to reduce property taxes, which was on the June 1978 ballot in California and spawned dozens of tax reduction measures in other states thereafter. And so often a vote in a single state on an initiative becomes a bellwether for groups on both sides and, by the way, for legislative action. It's pointed to as the marker for future action. I believe that California's Proposition 8 was playing that role for groups on both sides in 2008. And since the battle's not over, it's being waged, as you know, and in front of our temples and in many other places. Of possible future significance was a related vote in Arkansas that was a ban on gay couples from adopting children or serving as foster parents. It passed with 57% voting yes. My sense is that some in the interest group community will want to push this Arkansas measure onto the ballots of states like California and other states in the future. There were also it's important, I think, to talk a little bit about how people make up their minds on ballot initiatives. This plots Proposition 8 support over time from publicly available polls. I suspect that some in this room will have had access to private polls that will show a more finely grained variation in public opinion over time. For subjects upon which voters have a firm and resolved opinion, abortion, same-gender marriage, opinion tends to change less. On many ballot propositions, opinion changes rather dramatically. The norm for those measures, the ones upon which people have not formed opinions firmly yet, is for them to start out at about 60% support and then for that support to gradually diminish over time as the opposition campaign makes its case. It makes its case by saying this will cost too much, or it goes too far, or it's unnecessary. And so if you watch these across time and across states, the general pattern is for the slope to be downwards from yes towards no over time. And the only question is the intercept of the election day. Will it happen at a point in which the downward slope is above or below 50%? As you can see here, that was not the case with Proposition 8. If the vote had been cast at the start in May or June, it would have failed fairly substantially. The initial opinion on Proposition 8 was not in favor of passage. And that remained fairly true in the California poll and other media polls that I was able to access really until mid-September. And then in mid-September, this line changes, and actually they cross paths here. The No on 8 campaign kicked it into gear in early October with additional advertising, fundraising, and communication, and they passed the yes side towards the middle or end of October. And in the last publicly available polls, the margin was going to be 50% against, 47% in favor. The fact that that was reversed is very unusual. in my study of statewide ballot propositions. The no side, as I said, rebounded to take the lead shortly before November 4th, Election Day, but in the end the initiative passed, the yes side, 52% of the vote. A major reason for that passage is Barack Obama. He and his campaign, I described this grassroots field operation of mobilization, registration, and activation, turned out extraordinary numbers of African American and Latino voters. That was important in California because black voters voted 70% for Proposition 8, and Latino voters voted 53%. If Proposition 8 had only been decided by white and Asian voters, it would have failed, 49% and 49%, according to network exit polls. So in an irony of history, the mobilization of African Americans and Latinos was important. In terms of composition of the California electorate in 2008, blacks constituted about 10%. That's up a couple of percent from 2004 and 2000. And Latinos turned out at 18%. Again, up a percent or two from prior cycles. Whites, as I said in the earlier slide, were down nationally and they were down proportionately in California. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that California was not a presidential battleground state. Californians were not getting 17 pieces of mail a day in the presidential race. It did not have a highly contested Senate race. The voters who would be the most marginal voters, based upon education and experience, would be these black and Latino voters. They turned out because of an identification with a particular presidential candidate. And while there, also voted yes on Proposition 8 in fairly large numbers. I would say for African Americans, very large numbers. Now, I've tried to estimate. There are no numbers I know of that can give us a better number. You may have numbers. I would not estimate that LDS voters made up more than 2 to 2.5% of the California electorate on November 4th. This race was not determined by Latter-day Saint voters. Catholics were important. They were 30% of the votes, and it's fair for you to know in the context of these other demographics that, according to exit polls, Catholics voted 64% on the yes side. Now, of possible interest to you would be some other ballot initiatives around the country. As I said, these tend to come and come again and again. Abortion was put on the ballot in 3 states. It's been on the ballot in virtually every election in one way or another, either to limit it or to expand it. The 3 measures that were on the ballot in 2008 would have limited it further, restricted it further. In California, it would have required parental notification. It went down 48% yes, a majority voting no. The flip side, therefore, of the same-gender marriage, which makes it all the more interesting that the margins were that close. Colorado's definition of a person initiative is a very interesting measure. It defines a person as per state law in Colorado, should it have passed, as being a person from the moment of fertilization. That's the language in the initiative, or I assume conception. And for all kinds of implications, therefore, would essentially outlaw abortion, but create a set of other, I think, challenges to the political process and the medical profession, perhaps. It was very substantially defeated, 73% voting, 63% voting, no, 73% voting no. South Dakota had an abortion ban initiative. It has had one previously. That also failed, 45% voting yes. So these 3 measures that some would have considered also indicators of a conservative tide or a conservative movement all failed, while same-gender marriage in all 3 cases passed. Questions about Proposition 8 or the ballot initiatives generally before we turn to candidates and a bit about Utah elections in 2008?
Question, how much weight was put on the fact that the judges had erased the will of the people?
That was a campaign theme, and on the yes side especially. And that's a real challenge, President Packer, in terms of direct democracy and ballot initiatives, because as you know now, we're going to be going back to the courts and the judges will be deciding again. The courts have always been involved in adjudicating direct legislation, direct democracy, initiatives and referendums. A colleague and a good friend of mine, Jim Gordon, and I, who teaches at the law school, did an article years ago on pre-election judicial review of initiatives. Things like single subject rule, ballot signature solicitation processes, and frankly, this argument that's now come up about whether or not it needed to go to the legislature would have all been grounds for a pre-election judicial review in prior circumstances. And judges have been willing to throw off the ballot measures that failed on some of those tests. They also have been willing to declare unconstitutional statewide majority votes. The classic example is a California ballot initiative about housing in 1964, the open housing law. A majority of Californians voted for that, and the state Supreme Court and U.S. Supreme Court reversed it, saying that essentially the voters of California do not have the right to take away open housing, that is, blacks and Asians can buy a house just like white people, which was what the subject of the open housing law had been in the California legislature. On that basis, I think it could be challenged both in state court and in federal court, and I think it's likely going to be challenged all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Will the same judges be ruling?
In the state Supreme Court, yes. I'm not aware. Elder Cook would probably know if there's been any change in this election cycle. I don't think that any of them were up that were not returned to the state Supreme Court.
There's no same judges.
So it'll be the same judges.
If Proposition 8 is overturned by the judges, can that be appealed to the Supreme Court?
Yeah.
Can. Okay.
My understanding is it could be, because they could argue. Now, whether the court would take the case would again be at their discretion. But I would assume the appellants would be able to make the case that the court had overreached, and I think the Supreme Court gets to do whatever it wants to do on a matter like this. But that it would test that. Yes.
On the exit poll, the only one I could find that night was an election poll an exit poll and it was a little over 2,000 voters, and that's the one that had the 70% Africans voting for it. And is there pretty good evidence that these exit polls on only polling 2,000 people really give you the kind of assurance that the percentage of voters that were voting for something is along the lines that we've been talking about, or do we have a lot of confidence in those, or is that?
Well, that's a good question. I could follow up, and will be happy to, with a guy named Mark DiCamillo, who heads the Field Poll organization now. When I was a grad student years ago, Mr. Field himself was running it, and they probably have done some post-election polling. The short answer to you is often you can rely upon it. The markers would be, how did the overall vote projection for Obama and McCain do, and how did they do at a couple of other places. But frankly, their demographic breakout that I put up rings true compared to national data. I'm pretty confident that they're within the margin of error. Now, the challenge, as Mr. Field himself would have told you, having miscalled the Bradley election, the so-called Bradley effect that you were reading about in this election was Merv Field's error, because he had not factored in absentee voting. That was the first major statewide election in California, and he had election day voting, as he pointed out to me more than once, and on election day, Bradley won of people who voted. Now, the challenge for pollsters is to know how many of these votes were early votes. They have worked on methods to try and factor that in. I suspect a lot of the African American vote in this cycle in California was election day voting.
It ought to be mentioned that there was substantial money and resource that went from the coalition into the black and Hispanic communities.
That was very smart.
A lot of money was spent there getting to them. And their basic issue with the blacks was they didn't see it as a civil right. I mean, that was a big issue to them.
In some ways, it offends them when it's as if it demeans their struggle. Gays are not profiled in the same way that African Americans have been, and they haven't been excluded from graduate schools and asked to drink water at a different fountain. Yes, Elder Rasmussen.
David, you commented that the Catholic vote came out 60% in favor of Proposition 8.
Yes.
Was an LDS vote taken so that we know how much of the LDS voted?
Not in any of the polling I've been able to get. We're not a large enough demographic to have a breakout that they would report with statistical confidence. So, for example, when I compared the California votes I gave you with Arizona and Florida, back to Elder Cook's question, there wasn't a large enough N in the sample in Arizona or Florida for me to do the same detailed demographic of age and race and so forth. There was a big enough N, and the margins were wide enough on things like Latinos and blacks that they and I am comfortable. But given the nature of the issue, you would need to do a much larger sample than 2,000 to get sufficient Latter-day Saints in the random sample to do it. But I think we can predict with some confidence that the Latter-day Saint vote on this would have been well above the Catholic vote. The charge that I think is an unfair charge is that Mormons determined the outcome of this election. They certainly didn't with their votes. I think they were very important with their dollars and their volunteers.
Some black activists are now saying that it's not fair because the black people didn't understand what they were voting for. Have you picked up on that?
Yes, I have picked up on that. And this may be a divide between the activists and the parishioners, so to speak. I do think, in many ways, African Americans and Latinos get it. They are in these respects more conservative and very family oriented, and they wouldn't want to go out of their way to be discriminatory towards any person in a wide range of cases, but they don't know why they need to be able to claim marriage as a right. They don't see that as a civil right. They see that as a religious question. And frankly, it's an area where their religion, in both cases, the Latinos and the blacks, helps explain it. I mean, in some ways, we could have put another demographic here, which was attend church weekly or religion, which are also in the exit polls. And those markers point in the same direction. So this was in some ways a vote of the churched versus the unchurched.
The Catholic vote in the Hispanics were largely Catholic, so they would be in that 60%.
That's right. And I think that vote, based upon what I've read about it, swung a little bit later. I think if we were to go back to the over time chart, some of that surge at the end, I think, was the word got out in that last week. Apparently quite effectively to Catholics.
That's where we were.
That's our private polls showed the same thing.
And that's where the work was being done.
Elder Anderson.
We followed California and Arizona quite closely. Can you explain that wide margin in Florida a little bit better to us?
I suspect, but I don't know. Again, the sample was not as informative there, and I bored down a little bit more on California, but I think it's probably a strong evangelical vote there, and it's a state that is quite conservative. So in some ways, I think that was not a wise state for them to choose to make their bellwether. If I'd been advising them, and obviously I wasn't, I would have urged them to put all their eggs in a California basket this time, use it to then try and generate an argument that they had a national popular mandate for what they've only so far accomplished in courts and a couple of state legislatures. Well, let me shift to candidate elections because they turn out to be important and enduring. And the way that political scientists study candidate elections is to look at three variables. First and most important, what we call party identification. It's like a brand label preference. It's a standing choice that people made and continue to hold to. Some people change, but many don't. Often acquired in youth, sometimes even in childhood, that tends to endure and is very predictive. It's asked in the following way. Generally speaking, in politics, do you consider yourself to be a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, or what? Then the follow-up question is, do you consider yourself as a strong or a not very strong Republican? We won't tell them, but we define the not very strongs as weak Republicans. And if you answered independent, the follow-up question should be, Gallup now agrees, do you consider yourself as leaning towards the Republican or Democratic Party? That gives you then 7 categories, plus the people who refuse to classify themselves. In national surveys, since we first began doing it this way, since 1952, only about 2 or 3% have been anything other than those three, independent, Republican, or Democrat. So they tend not to amount to an important, a large enough group to worry much about. Does it matter? Well, here's what you had in 2008 in the national vote. Of the Democrats, and I've classified the independent-leaning Democrats as Democrats and the independent-leaning Republicans as Republicans. That's because they really are closet Democrats and closet Republicans behaviorally. You can scratch an independent, a leaning independent, and you'll find a partisan. 89% of Democrats voted for Obama, 90% of Republicans voted for McCain. This is a classic, pretty straight party vote relative to other presidential elections. Neither candidate made major inroads among the other party's voters. Well, then why did it turn out to be a margin as wide as it was for Obama? Well, it was because, as I showed you at the beginning, not as many Republicans turned out. And in the last 4 years, a substantial increase in Democrats have registered to vote, and some people have switched parties. The surge in Democrats has come mostly among young voters and new voters. And so some of those are new immigrants and so forth. Independents split 52 to 44 for Obama. Now, who are these independents? They're about 10% of the electorate. They're not your League of Women Voters ideal voter. They tend to be the least informed and the least connected. The strong partisans tend to be the most informed and the most connected, despite sort of the popular notion in the public. In terms of party identification among Utah voters, let me talk a little bit about candidate appeal. I said there are three variables. The second one is candidate appeal, what you like and you don't like about the candidates. These are often general traits, but they can become quite specific traits. In the exit polling, three I thought were informative. In terms of which candidate, does this candidate have sufficient experience that you're comfortable voting for them? Both of them passed the majority threshold. 50% said yes for Obama, 59% for McCain. Is the candidate in touch with people like you? Does he relate well to you? Somebody like you. In other words, and here Obama does 20 points or so better than McCain. People saw him as more in touch with them. Maybe it's because he's got his BlackBerry. Judgment, an area where I think both Hillary Clinton and McCain aggressively went negative on Obama. He still prevailed by about 8 points. More people considered him to have the judgment suitable for a president than considered McCain to have that. Now, people could say both, and many did. So it wasn't either or. It was a question of enough of these characteristics that you would vote for him. In the broad area of candidate appeal, then, Obama carried the election. There are a few dimensions. Experience in national security, for example, where McCain clearly was outperforming Obama. Elder Porter?
David, on the middle category, in touch, McCain tried to portray himself as a man of the people, down to earth, military veteran, spoke the language of the southern redneck, so to speak, whereas Obama was painted a lot, even sometimes by liberal columnists, as a little bit out of touch.
Right.
Harvard educated, spoke in this kind of highfalutin language. How did it come out this way? How do you account for
Well,
that?
it's a good question. I don't get to ask the follow-up through the exit poll, so I'm speculating here. But my sense is that part of that was age. We had a lot of younger voters, and I think a lot of people related to Obama. I think they felt that he was in touch on the one major crisis of the campaign, which was the economic meltdown and how the two candidates dealt with it. That speaks, I think, also to the judgment dimension. I don't know for sure. It's a good question. Let's shift to Utah now, and this gives you a sense of party identification. We didn't choose BYU and Utah colors by making the Republicans red here, just so you know. I understand that you check each other's ties this week. Republicans in 2008 again had a substantial more than 2-to-1 advantage. Again, this is a standing brand label preference, and that gives them a substantial advantage in Utah politics and elections. Democrats at 25%, independents at about 13%, other at about 4%. Let's look at how it matters in terms of how people vote. This is the votes for Congressman Bishop in the 1st Congressional District. As you can see, he got 94% of the strong Democrats, 91% of the weak Republicans, strong Republicans, weak Republicans. He got 84% of the independent-leaning Republicans. They're really not independents. And he got only 19% of the independent-leaning Democrats. They're really not independents. He picked up a majority of the pure independents. And this gives him what I would call the kind of normal distribution for a Mike Leavitt, John Huntsman kind of Republican campaign in Utah. And that is the normal, I think, Utah pattern. Now let's look at the Matheson vote in 2008, and this is not unlike numbers I've shown you in prior cycles. Matheson wins as a Democrat in a largely Republican district by getting 97% of the Democrats. I can't believe this number, so I'm going to double check it when I get home, but 100% of the weak Democrats and 98% of the independent Democrats. So on average, something approaching 99% of the Democrats. But he also gets 31% of the strong Republicans. This is like heresy. 62% of the weak Republicans and 59% of the independent Republicans. Weak Republicans and weak Democrats are the groups that you target as swing voters, more than independent Democrats and independent Republicans. These are the Reagan Democrats, nationally, weak Democrats. And this is a group that Democrats, when they win, are able to get 40, 50%. And around 59% of the independent Republicans. The Democrats made a concerted effort, especially in Utah County, to run candidates who were active Latter-day Saints, moderate, and they got about 26 to 28% of the vote. So the party identification factor is even more predictive in low information elections. When you know less about the race, you vote your party preference. You vote your brand label preference. That concludes what I prepared, brother, and if there are any other questions, I'd be happy to take them. Thank you very much.
David, do you look at all at the state legislature?
We do. We track for a textbook that I work on those. I haven't looked as carefully. There were some inroads for Democrats there as well. It's fair to say that the interest groups, understanding that redistricting is coming, saw 2008 as an important part of a two-step process to get the legislatures where they want them for the next decade's boundary drawing. And I think Democrats picked up some houses in some state legislatures and held some that Republicans were contesting in states like Colorado.
How do you see the gay-lesbian coalitions moving forward with power? Where do you see them going?
Well, for them, this is a very centrally and closely held issue. It's very much a part of their identity, and they want validation. And that's part of why they're stepping into the public square and seeking it in these ways, I think. So they're not going to go away. They will be very aggressive. Frankly, they're very smart in their use of the media, both news media, but also even more the popular media. That's why I think the issue of tolerance, which became so central to Proposition 8, did not start in this campaign. That had been a multi-year effort to try and define this issue as about acceptance and tolerance and we can all get along. So I think they will continue with their barrage in the media, and I think I said early on to some friends, if this becomes a vote of the gays versus the Mormons, we're going to lose twice. And it needed to be and was a broader coalition. Because they would love to, and they're choosing to disparage us because in the public eye we're less understood and more negatively viewed than are African Americans or Latinos or the Catholic Church. And so they will do what I think they're doing. They will try and make this a referendum on what they're going to call hate and intolerance. And I don't think they're going to make inroads given the new administration in terms of any national legislation. I mean, part of this is a lot of that Obama vote will be writing him too. One of the things I saw as I visited both McCain and Obama headquarters is an extraordinary connection. This is a level of engagement that I've never seen in politics before. The Obama campaign is more data-driven and committed to engagement. It's not just about a contribution and a vote. It's about talking to a friend. It's about communicating with others. And I think when they reach out, they will, those grassroots people that were in those storefront offices in Watts and other places are going to communicate on their issues. So I think it's going to be waged at the state level and the local level with respect to marriage, but they are going to push on other parts of their agenda, and I certainly don't think it's going to go away.
I agree.
How powerful do you think it will be?
It's less powerful now after what happened on November 4th. The vote is a marker, as I said, and that's why they fought it so aggressively, and why they're so bitterly disappointed that it didn't go their way. I think they read those polling numbers that I showed you and became overconfident and a bit complacent in their margin of support. I don't think that'll happen again. I do think, in response, President Packard, to your question, that it will come back on the ballot in California. If I've looked at issue agendas over time, and because this is driven by a petition, they just have to meet a fairly low threshold for a well-funded group, and they're going to try and find some other way to do it. But when they're doing that, you're going to be on the no side, which you were on Proposition 22. And when you're in an initiative on the no side, you have important structural advantages with the argument, because you're defending the status quo in that instance. They're trying to change things. And that gives the church an advantaged position. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how the courts deal with this, and the whole topic of unelected judges and so forth and so on. It was Ballot Initiatives years ago which got Chief Justice Rose Bird of the California Supreme Court in trouble. And the California attorneys in the room would know better than I what the institutional memory is about that. But they vote against a popular vote at their own peril in California, because they must stand for a retention election as a state Supreme Court justice. And an organized group took down 3 sitting state California Supreme Court justices in California. So there's a bit of the accountability mechanism built into California law, which will influence them to see this differently now that the vote's been cast. I don't want to overgeneralize. I don't know enough to be sure. Yes?
Do you detect, or are you aware of any group, formal or informal, behind the gay and lesbian movement?
I know of no group behind it. I mean, the major front group for them is the Human Rights Campaign. And notice how skillful these groups on both sides are in terminology and labeling. It's like choice with abortion. So Human Rights Campaign, doesn't that convey that who could be against human rights, right? And it speaks to the whole issue you confronted in this race.
Well, you'd have to say that the entertainment industry is very strong on the gay side.
Yes.
For example, they had one evening in Barbara Streisand's home and raised $3,900,000 in one 2-hour meeting at her home. Give you an idea of the power of the media. That's also, I think, why the media puts the twist on this. They do.
That's right. I think you are taking on a well-funded side, but I don't think there's a group behind that. I mean, in other words, I think things like the Human Rights Campaign and others organize those donors, and then have political consultants and others that are going to target their opportunities.
Alan's question, I think one of the things that was surprising is that the ad against you showing the 2 missionaries that came on at the end, it was a group, and in that group one of the identified groups was MoveOn.org, which surprised us a little bit on that. I think that's a really important question that we need to follow up on a little bit, and why MoveOn.org moved into that. Well, not particularly surprising, given that.
Yeah. Well, I've interviewed Mr. Boyd actually in his home in the Berkeley Hills. It's so Berkeley. 2 dogs, find a spot to sit if you can move the dogs. I'm a little surprised too. I mean, I would think there's a lot of overlap in the constituencies of both groups, and I think there's going to be sympathy there. They will bring a substantial network, and they are innovators in the use of the internet as a tool for politics. Much of what Obama did expanded upon what Move On had done. I think it took it to whole new levels. But I think Move On is a formidable group, and if they're going to become involved, it suggests a broadening of the coalition, which would have been smart for them from the get-go. So They may have been finally reaching out to groups as they saw your numbers, the yes numbers rise, and say, we got to build a coalition here. Endorsements and support in initiatives is important. It's not like a vote for a candidate where you have the standing choice. You got the white hats and the black hats, or the red ties and the blue ties, and you know kind of where you stand. In an initiative, you got to make up your mind every time, and you got a whole bunch of them coming at you. So you're looking for cues, and the importance of cues to an initiative voter is very important. Where do those come from? Groups. Editorial endorsements are often very important. Now, advertising is very important, and it's often emotive, and it's often not linked to the issue. I did some consulting on the horse race gambling vote in Utah some years ago, and Wendell Ashton had invited me to help with that, and I remember going to my first meeting, and so labeling and how the issue gets defined is critical. You must be in charge of the definition of the question, not what's on the ballot, what it's in the voters' heads. And we were meeting, and he said, this is a vote about parimutuel wagering. And I raised my hand and I said, this is the last time we'll ever use those two words. This is about horse race gambling. It's not parimutuel wagering. If we are defining this as parimutuel wagering, we've lost this election. That cleans it up. Most people have no idea what parimutuel is. Is that an insurance company? And what is wagering? We're all for that, aren't we?
So it's gone wrong.
So, but again, if you went to the technical, no offense intended, lawyer speak of the measure, you'd fallen into a trap. You had to call it what you needed to call it so the voters understood what it was. And there's going to be an intense battle over definition. Issue definition is going to be the most important thing you do in an initiative race.
That's why it stayed same sex and not same gender.
I think it's wise. And I think you want to do a lot of research on how to frame the question if you're in charge of it. And then you need to do a lot of research on how you can try and interpret the question to persuade voters. And initiative purists get really upset when I'm about this point of the conversation because they say, well, we want it to be vote on what we intended. I say, well, that's not what's going to happen. We're going to fight this out with a public that has a limited attention span and is looking for a cue. And they need to understand what it's about, and the other side is going to take one small part of it and make that what's important.
Thank you.
Great. Super.